So, I was originally gonna do a video on Ampharos focusing on Gen 2. But since I've had a Gen 2 video in the works for a while, I ended up changing my mind. Let me know down below if you still want a separate video on the evolution line though. But real quick, Luna's World. If you like relaxing lo-fi, then Luna's World could be the place for you. With that said, let's get started. So what Pokemon did I decide to go with for today? I landed on a Gen 3 Pokemon, Kyogre. I started with Venusaur, a starter, then Flareon, an evolution. So I figured the next archetype should be a legendary of some kind. And also, I just kind of felt like talking about it in the moment, I guess. There's a lot of legendaries to talk about, but I feel like Kyogre is such a good standard of what a legendary should be. It's not as unique as Mewtwo was for Gen 1, as that Pokemon was a man-made clone and had a more mysterious backstory that was pretty surprising at the time for the series. That's also why I think Kyogre is a great standard legendary. It's essentially an ancient creature that's terrifying. Very much the trope of most legendaries. But Kyogre, being basically a giant stylized whale, kind of gives it a slightly more grounded fear of the unknown of the deep sea. Even if it does kind of look like a toy whenever it's in 3D. So to really explain why Kyogre is the perfect water type legendary, I kind of have to go back to the first generation for a moment, which of course didn't have any kind of water type legendaries. And on top of that, the water typing was not exactly what you think it may have been back then. In single player, water was absolutely essential, and if your first time playing, probably feels like the second best typing behind Psychic. Not to mention, even if it were a mediocre typing, you needed Surf to beat the game anyway, a very essential HM move, which, thankfully, is actually an excellent move. But the reality of the water typing in red, blue, and yellow is kinda complicated. It's actually not nearly as strong in the endgame as you might think it is. It's great earlier on, certainly. But in modern Pokemon, what do you think of as a typing to counter with water? Fire, right? Well, fire types suck in Gen 1. What about rock types? Well, those are often paired up with the ground typing as a dual type, so that means it'll also have a 4 times weakness ice type coverage, meaning the difference between water and ice attacks against those top tier rocks like Rhydon is basically meaningless. And on top of that, those ice type moves are super effective against flying types. See where I'm going here? Because certain Pokemon weak to water would either be one-shot by ice anyway, or just a bad fire Pokemon, the water typing at a high level wasn't that meaningful. It's genuinely worse than ice, with fighting types also lacking real fighting moves in Gen 1, making ice an actual appealing typing. Game Freak knew all of this basically a year or so into the game's history. In some of the earliest metas, like Nintendo Cup 97, Jinx was the top tier Pokemon. This was partly because of Double Team not being banned, and also the Ice Psychic typing was genuinely excellent. Another example of this is Starmie in OU, where even the Smogon page for it has to acknowledge that the water typing is more of a liability in that format in red, blue, and yellow. Basically, this would change immediately in GSC, and you'd want a water type move on Starmie in Gen 2. But basically, amongst the most knowledgeable players even in the 90s, the water typing didn't quite strike fear in Gen 1 quite like it would later against other players, despite good water types existing. If Kyogre had existed in this gen, it would still be crazy, but it wouldn't have had quite the impact it did. Now, I know I just went into a tangent on the water type and its balance before Gen 3, but it is pretty important context here, because there were people who took notice of this to a certain extent, especially after the game's balance changed so drastically going into Gen 2 and then 3. Even noticeable amongst some casuals. It made Kyogre's impression different in 2003. I can assure you, I was 9 years old when I got my Sapphire copy. Kyogre is scary. probably even more than Groudon. But why though? Groudon is probably more of an immediate threat to us landlubbers than Kyogre. Not to say that Kyogre couldn't also just eradicate us all on a whim, but being a sea creature does make it feel a bit more distant. But that's also the appeal of it. The deep sea is terrifying, and Kyogre is a part of the deepest, most unknown parts of this sea that captivates our imaginations, and also our greatest fears of the unknown. Interestingly, in Gen 3, the game opposite of the mascot describes them as a savior. That is, Sapphire's Pokédex entry for Groudon states that it was a savior to people who suffered from floods, which I assume was an unintentional action on the Pokémon's part. Ruby does this for Kyogre, saying it saved people from droughts. I feel like this has to be on purpose, but I'm not entirely sure why it's for the opposite versions. Maybe because you're not forced to face them in the main game, and they're more of a side endeavor to encounter when they're not the mascot, and therefore are more believable as a Pokemon that can cause something good to happen. Then, there's how Kyogre functions in gameplay. Yeah, we all know it's strong. It's a legendary with a 670 base stat total. No one was shocked that this thing could live up to the hype. But Gen 3 took the concept of weather effects and really ramped it up with these legendaries. The fact that both Groudon and Kyogre can both apply weather effects automatically by just showing up, it was immediately obvious just how insane they were going to be. Even more so with Kyogre, as the automatic rain boosted its own water attacks, whereas Groudon's sun doesn't boost its own stab, though it is still very handy for this beast. So basically, you could just bring in Kyogre, rain starts pouring, surf turn 1, and yeah, it's brutal. Honestly, the stats, bulk, drizzle ability, it all just makes Kyogre the perfect water type. And even as early as Ruby and Sapphire, this thing already had access to so many moves. The coverage is really freaking good. Thunder, Ice Beam, Rock Slide, Brick Break. There's so much you can do besides just substitute in bulky Sleep Talk sets. Ice Beam in particular is a great way to try to deal with Rayquaza, though it's not nearly as popular in competitive RSC Ubers as Groudon and Kyogre. I also think this speaks to a greater point that the Weather Trio is such a great group of legendary Pokemon, sharing some design sensibilities, but all sticking out, making their mark in gameplay individually. It fits right in with the series too, still being pretty based in nature, creatures, and the environment. They're kind of over the top for where the series was at before Gen 3, but definitely not indulgent in concept. It was the beginning of making legendaries a part of some potential world-ending threat if things had gone wrong in the plot, where something like Mewtwo just wanted to be left alone in its cave, or Lugia just quietly guarded the seas. Legendaries before this were more like background lore pieces, until Crystal had the Suicune encounter that you basically couldn't miss. Another pretty good water type, by the way, though power creep has definitely caught up to it. That's the other thing about Kyogre. Power creep has put a ton of other Pokemon back, whether it's VGC, the Smogon Ubers tier, anything. But Kyogre is still so good. It's never been subpar by the legendary standard at all, being a top tier in every generation since its debut. Watch VGC, Smogon Ubers, or almost any doubles match where Kyogre is allowed. It's just always an excellent, ideal pick for your team. My only nitpick is that the primal form was never as popular as Groudon's in Gen 6. You just never saw it as much, and even on the ORAS viability and usage lists, it seems to be accepted as a strong mon, but way behind in that meta. But otherwise, Kyogre is one of the most consistent Pokemon ever, and a perfect example of what peak performance looks like for a specific typing. In this case, the water type. And that's pretty much what's allowed it to remain on top consistently in terms of legendaries. And those are some of my brief thoughts on Kyogre. How did you first come across it? Was it in ORAS, or did you play Pokemon Sapphire back in the day? I'll probably do a non-legendary video next, but any Pokemon you guys want me to do, be sure to put them in the comment section below.